This is my true story. I never thought the day would come when my own son would write me dead on paper. I spent years paying for life insurance so he would never struggle when I was gone. But he couldn't wait. One morning, people came to my house with flowers, saying they were sorry for my passing. That was how I found out my son had buried me alive, on paper, and stolen my life's savings. But I didn't scream. I smiled, because I knew exactly what I would do next. Before I tell you how I returned, tell me where you're watching from and subscribe. My story deserves to be heard. I spent my whole life building something small but honest. My days began before sunrise and ended long after sunset. My hands were rough, my back was tired, but my heart was always full. I worked not for luxury, but for stability, for a roof that would never leak, and for a table that would never stay empty. I started with nothing. No inheritance, no connections, no shortcuts. Only a pair of strong arms and a promise to myself that my family would never go hungry like I did as a boy. I was the son of a farmer who never had more than 2 shirts and 1 pair of shoes. So when I finally got my first steady job, I treated every paycheck like gold. Every dollar went somewhere meaningful, toward food, savings, and one small dream at a time. My son was born when I was still young enough to dream big, but old enough to know what reality costs. I remember holding him in my arms and feeling like life had finally given me something pure, something to protect. That day, I made a vow. I would work until my bones broke before I let my family suffer. And for decades, I kept that vow. There were winters when the cold bit through my coat, and summers so hot the air itself seemed to burn. But I never missed a day of work. I never complained. I carried crates, loaded trucks, cleaned machines, lifted steel, anything that brought food home. My body aged faster than my years, but my spirit stayed strong. Because every evening when I walked through the door and saw my family eat, I felt rich. There were times when I'd come home too tired to talk, but I'd still sit at the table and listen. My wife would tell stories about the day. My son would chatter about school. I didn't always understand everything, but their laughter was the music that healed every ache. That was my reward. I didn't need applause. I didn't need luxury. I just needed them. Every week, I'd put a small amount aside, sometimes only a few dollars, sometimes just coins. But I saved, slowly, patiently. I didn't believe in wasting or gambling. I believed in building. And when I found out about life insurance, I saw it as one more way to protect what mattered most. I didn't buy it for myself. I bought it for them, for my family, for the people I loved. I thought it was the final gift I could give when I was no longer here. I paid every premium on time. I never missed a payment. Even when times were hard, even when my health began to fail, I made sure that bill was covered. It wasn't easy. There were months when I skipped new clothes or a doctor's visit just to keep that policy alive. I believed that paper was more than a contract. It was a promise, a father's last promise to his child. As years passed, my son grew up watching me work. He saw my early mornings, my late nights, the calluses on my palms. He saw the times I came home coughing from dust or limping from exhaustion. I thought he understood. I thought he saw the meaning behind the struggle. I thought he'd carry it forward with pride. But time plays tricks on people. The things we do out of love, others start to see as weakness. I didn't realize that while I was teaching him how to live, the world outside was teaching him how to take. He grew ambitious, not for peace, but for power. And though I didn't see it then, small cracks began forming in the foundation I had built. Still, I worked. I kept faith in the goodness of my child. I told myself he'd never betray what we stood for. Every time he'd ask about the insurance papers or the house deeds, I thought it was care. I didn't see curiosity turning into calculation. In my later years, I began to slow down. My body couldn't lift as it once did. My eyesight dimmed and my memory faltered sometimes. But I was content. I believed my son would carry the legacy. I believed all my effort had created something stable, not just money, but values. Even after retirement, I couldn't sit still. I'd wake up early, brew tea, and walk to the garden. I'd check my mailbox for bills, smile at old neighbors, feed the stray dog that used to wait outside my gate. Life was quiet, humble, peaceful, and I thought peace would last. But peace is a fragile thing. It exists until someone decides to disturb it, and I didn't know that someone would be the very person I'd once carried on my shoulders. Looking back, I realize how naive I was. I believed that hard work and honesty could protect me from betrayal. But life doesn't work that way. Hard work can build walls, but trust builds the door. And sometimes, the person you let through that door is the one who burns the house down. Still, if I had to do it all again, I would. I would still work those long hours. I would still pay those insurance premiums. Because everything I did came from love, not fear. I wanted my son to have a life without hunger or debt. I wanted him to stand tall without needing to climb over others. The years blurred into each other. Birthdays, anniversaries, quiet dinners. I aged quietly, watching him become a man. When he got his first job, I was proud. When he moved into his own house, I was proud again. And when he started taking charge of my paperwork, my accounts, my insurance, my pension, I felt proud one more time. I thought I'd raised someone responsible. In those moments, I never saw deceit. I only saw care. He would say, "Don't worry, I'll handle the documents." And I'd smile, thinking, he's become the man I hoped for. I couldn't have known that the same hands I once taught to write his name would later forge mine. That the same voice that once called me father would one day tell the world I was gone. But before that storm, there was calm. There was still love in my heart and faith in his. I remember one winter evening sitting by the fire, holding the insurance papers, thinking how far we had come. My house, my family, my savings, everything was in order. I had finally built a safe future for them. I smiled to myself that night, unaware that I had already been erased on paper. Years of effort condensed into those few documents, the policy, the signatures, the account details. I kept them safe, thinking they would protect him when I couldn't. And in a way, they did. Just not the way I expected. People say time heals all wounds, but time also hides betrayal until it's ready to show you. And that's what happened to me. I didn't lose my savings because of misfortune. I lost them because I trusted too deeply. I wasn't a rich man, but I was proud of what I had built, a house, a name, a legacy. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that pride doesn't need diamonds to shine. It just needs honesty. I kept that honesty my whole life. I didn't cheat. I didn't steal. I didn't step on anyone to rise. My son saw that every single day. But what he learned wasn't the same lesson I thought I was teaching. He saw how patience can be mistaken for weakness, how silence can be taken advantage of, how kindness can be exploited. And he learned that in this world, the easiest way to gain power is to take it from someone who trusts you. I don't blame the world for that. I don't even blame myself anymore. But I remember every morning I walked out with sore knees and came back with tired eyes, and I remember thinking, at least my son will never suffer like I did. If only I had known that suffering doesn't always come from poverty. Sometimes it comes from betrayal. Still, my years of work were not wasted. They made me stronger than he ever expected. Because when you've built your life with your own hands, you also know how to rebuild it when it's torn apart. And that's exactly what I did. It began quietly, like most betrayals do. No thunder, no announcement. Just a strange feeling that something was wrong. I didn't know it at first. I thought it was old age, the way people look at you differently when they think your time is fading. But this was not that. This was colder, more deliberate. It started with whispers, little things. Neighbors who used to wave stopped by with sympathetic smiles. A friend from church came to the door with flowers. He said he was sorry for my passing. I laughed at first, thinking it was a mistake. But when he showed me the card, with my full name printed neatly, the laughter died in my throat. I didn't understand what was happening. How could I be dead when I was standing right there? I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I asked him who told him, and he said my son had announced it. Told everyone I had passed peacefully. He said the funeral had been private, just family. My heart froze. At first, I thought maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe it was a cruel joke or a paperwork mix-up. But as days passed, more letters arrived. Sympathy cards, condolences, even a notice from the insurance company confirming my death. That was when I knew this wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. I went to the bank the next morning to fix it. The teller looked at me like she'd seen a ghost. She whispered to her coworker, and they both checked the system. My name was listed as deceased. My accounts were frozen. My pension had stopped. Everything I had built over 50 years, locked behind one false statement. I left the bank trembling, not from fear, but from disbelief. My son, the boy I raised, the man I trusted, had erased me from existence. He had turned my name into profit. People talk about heartbreak like it's a sharp pain, something sudden. But it's not. It's slow. It's heavy. It's like drowning with your eyes open. You see everything slipping away, but you can't scream loud enough to stop it. That's how it felt. I sat in my living room that night, staring at the insurance documents I had framed years ago. I'd once seen them as symbols of safety. Now they looked like a weapon, and my son was holding it. For the first time in my life, I didn't sleep. My heart beat loud enough to drown out the ticking clock. Every thought came back to one question: why? Why would a son bury his father on paper for money that wasn't even his yet? But deep down, I already knew the answer. Greed. Greed and impatience. He wanted what he hadn't earned. He wanted the reward without the waiting. I had taught him how to work, but the world had taught him how to take. The next morning, I checked the mail. More letters, all addressed to the estate of my name. Legal letters, insurance confirmations, even advertisements for funeral services. It was surreal. I stood there holding proof of my own death, and I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. I didn't cry. Not yet. I couldn't. My tears were locked behind disbelief. Instead, I went through my drawers, looking for clues. Somewhere between my pension forms and bank letters, I found the copies of the insurance policy. They had my son listed as beneficiary, as I had intended. But what I hadn't realized was that he also had copies of my ID, my signature samples, and my bank details. Everything he needed to forge the claim was already in his hands, because I gave it to him. I gave it to him out of love, out of trust. I had built my life on the belief that trust is the foundation of family. But in that moment, it felt like trust was the very rope around my neck. The next few days passed in silence. No calls from him. No visits. Just rumors and pity from people who thought they were comforting my ghost. I started avoiding them, hiding inside. The outside world thought I was gone, and in a way, I was. But inside that silence, something changed in me. The pain hardened. It stopped being confusion and became focus. I stopped asking why and started asking how. How do I come back? How do I reclaim not just my money, but my name? I started writing everything down, every rumor, every message, every strange letter. It was my first act of defiance, a record of truth in a sea of lies. At one point, I saw a local news clip about a charity donation my son had made. He stood there smiling for cameras, holding a check, speaking about his late father's wish to give back. I watched that screen and felt something in me finally break. That wasn't grief anymore. That was awakening. He had not only stolen from me, he had used my death to polish his image. My hard-earned money, my quiet years of saving, my very existence, all turned into his performance of generosity. And so, I stopped being the victim that night. I decided I would come back from the dead, not with noise, but with proof. I began calling old contacts from work. Some didn't recognize my voice at first. Some thought it was a prank. But when they heard me speak, when they saw me face to face, the shock on their faces told me one thing. The lie was bigger than I thought. My son had told everyone. He hadn't just filed insurance papers. He had woven a story so complete that nobody questioned it. He had even arranged a fake memorial service. There had been candles, photos, speeches. People cried. He stood there collecting sympathy while I sat at home, unaware, drinking tea alone. That night, I couldn't breathe. I walked to the mirror and looked at myself. An old man, wrinkles, gray hair, tired eyes, but still alive. And that was all I needed. I was alive. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I didn't know where to begin, but I knew I had to. I told him everything. The fake death, the insurance claim, the forged signatures. He didn't believe me at first. But when I showed him the mail, the documents, the death certificate, his face changed. He asked me to stay quiet while he investigated. So I did. I stayed quiet. I waited. Weeks passed, and the world still thought I was dead. But under that silence, truth was starting to move. My lawyer began gathering records, cross-checking dates, comparing signatures. Every day brought a new revelation, how deep the forgery ran, how many people had been fooled. Each detail cut like a blade, but each one also gave me power. Proof was becoming my weapon, and through it all, I never once called my son. I never shouted. I wanted him to think I was truly gone, so that when I returned, it wouldn't be with anger. It would be with finality. I kept remembering his face when he was a child, the boy who used to fall asleep on my lap, who used to ask me to tell him stories before bed. That memory hurt more than anything else, because that boy was gone. In his place stood a man who had traded love for greed. When I finally looked through his financial records, the donations, the luxury purchases, the new car, I didn't see success. I saw my work wearing someone else's name tag. Every dollar was one of my breaths, one of my years. And I realized I couldn't just reclaim the money. I had to reclaim my story. It wasn't about wealth anymore. It was about truth. So I planned my return. Quietly, carefully. I would not return as a broken man begging for justice. I would return as the truth itself, undeniable, documented, alive. By the time I finished preparing, the old fear was gone. I was not afraid of being forgotten anymore. I was ready to make sure I'd never be mistaken for dead again. The betrayal that began with whispers would end in a room full of silence, the kind that comes only when everyone realizes what they've done, and that silence would belong to me. When the smoke finally began to clear, I saw the full size of what he had done. It wasn't just a lie told in haste or a form accidentally filed. It was a deliberate act, layered in calculation and wrapped in the softness of my trust. My son had not only told the world that I was dead, he had built an entire structure of falsehood around it. Every document, every phone call, every form was carefully planned. He had studied the system the way I once studied my work, with dedication, with patience, and with a purpose that poisoned everything I had taught him. The first confirmation came from the insurance company. Their letter, cold and professional, stated the claim had been processed, the funds released, and the case closed. It carried my name, my policy number, my signature, but the handwriting wasn't mine. I stared at it for hours, tracing the curves of the letters that pretended to be me. It felt like someone had stolen my reflection, and the mirror refused to admit it. I took the papers to my lawyer, and he looked at them quietly before speaking. "This isn't amateur work," he said softly. "It's precise." Someone knew exactly what they were doing. That sentence hung in the air like smoke after a fire. It meant the thing I feared most was true. It wasn't desperation. It was design. He had forged my death certificate. He had submitted witness statements. He had presented proof of burial, all with perfect timing. He knew I lived alone, knew that I wasn't often visited, knew that if someone came looking, they would find only silence. That was his weapon, my solitude. The years I had spent in peace had become the very camouflage for his deceit. I felt like the ground under my feet had shifted. The documents that once symbolized protection were now evidence of betrayal. My savings, my policies, even the little pension I depended on, all of it had been moved. The numbers on the page weren't just figures. They were my life converted into digits, transferred into his hands. At first, I wanted to confront him, to look into his eyes and ask how he could bury his own father while he was still breathing. But my lawyer stopped me. He said it was not time for emotion. It was time for strategy. I listened. I forced myself to be calm, because I knew now that this was not about anger. This was about truth, and truth needed preparation. So I began to gather everything. I went through every letter, every bill, every old receipt I had ever kept. My table became a battlefield covered in paper. I made copies of everything, the real documents and the forged ones. And as I laid them side by side, I saw how carefully he had mimicked me. The handwriting, the phrasing, the details. He knew me so well that he could fake my voice in writing. That realization broke something inside me, because the person who knew me best had used that knowledge to erase me. There was a moment, a quiet night, when I sat alone in the dark with the documents spread before me. I remember thinking, he didn't just kill me on paper, he buried our bond too. That was when I stopped feeling like a victim. I began to think like a survivor. I spent days with my lawyer reconstructing the timeline. Every claim, every signature, every false step. The picture grew clearer. The funds had been transferred to his account in 3 stages. Small deposits first, then the large final payment. It was all traceable, all provable. But before we could act, we needed official acknowledgement that I was alive. It sounds strange, doesn't it? Having to prove your own existence, standing before a clerk and explaining that the death certificate was false, that the dead man was here, breathing, speaking. The first official I met blinked at me in disbelief. He looked at me as though I were a ghost who refused to stay quiet. But once the fingerprints matched and the identification confirmed, the room changed. Silence fell, followed by whispers of shock. The report was filed, identity confirmed, death certificate fraudulent. It was the first step toward resurrection, not of body, but of truth. With that report in hand, my lawyer contacted the insurance company. They were stunned. To them, I was a closed case, a processed claim. Now, suddenly, I was standing in front of them, alive and calm, asking how such a massive fraud had passed unnoticed. Their faces told the story: embarrassment, guilt, disbelief. But rules are rules. They opened an investigation. For the first time, the wind began to shift in my direction. Each new document revealed another layer of deceit. My son had not acted alone. He had hired a contact to help file the paperwork. He had used fake witnesses, even gone so far as to stage communications with the funeral home. He left nothing to chance. He had turned bureaucracy into his accomplice. And yet, in all his precision, he made one mistake. He underestimated me. He thought age had dulled my awareness. He thought grief would keep me quiet. He thought I was too slow to follow the trail. But he forgot one thing. I had spent my life solving problems, fixing what was broken, building things from scratch. And this time, what was broken was my name. So I began to rebuild it, piece by piece. The investigation stretched on for weeks. The company froze his funds. They traced every transaction and every signature. They cross-verified witnesses who suddenly couldn't remember details. His web began to unravel. The truth, once hidden under his confidence, started to breathe again. During that time, I stayed invisible. I didn't go to his house. I didn't call. I wanted him to believe he had won, because the greatest shock isn't being accused. It's being caught by someone you thought was gone. There were moments when I felt old beyond my years. The process was exhausting. The meetings, the documents, the statements. But every signature I gave, every line I corrected, felt like reclaiming a heartbeat. I was writing myself back into existence, one paper at a time. Some nights I would think about how we got here. I would remember teaching him how to tie his shoes, how to ride a bicycle, how to look people in the eye when speaking. I had taught him integrity, but somewhere along the way, he replaced it with cunning. It wasn't just my name he had stolen. It was my lessons, twisted into something unrecognizable. But even as the truth surfaced, I didn't feel hatred, just clarity. Hatred burns quickly. Clarity lasts. By the end of the investigation, the evidence was irrefutable. The insurance company's report concluded fraud. My name was officially reinstated as alive, valid, and uncontested. They apologized formally, even offered compensation for the distress caused. I didn't want the money. I wanted accountability. The case was handed to law enforcement. They began their own inquiry. Bank accounts were flagged. Transactions frozen. My son's name went from beneficiary to suspect. It was strange, watching justice move so slowly, yet so surely. Like watching dawn creep into a dark room. At first, just a sliver of light. Then more. Then enough to see everything clearly. People around me began to notice. The neighbors who once whispered condolences now avoided my eyes. Not because they hated me, but because guilt makes people quiet. They had believed him easily. They had mourned me without question. Now they didn't know how to face the man who refused to stay buried. I didn't blame them. Lies are easier to believe when they come wrapped in grief. My lawyer told me we could press criminal charges. But I asked for time. I wanted to think. I didn't want revenge to become my only language. What I wanted was restoration. To see his lies stripped away. To watch him stand in front of the truth he created and fail to recognize it. The moment that thought settled in my mind, I knew exactly what to do next. I told my lawyer I wanted to confront him, not in secret, not in anger, but in the open, where the world could see what he had done. And I knew the perfect place, his workplace, the company where he boasted about carrying on his father's legacy. That was where the next chapter of my life, and his lesson, would begin. When I looked in the mirror that night, I saw an old man with tired eyes. Yes, but I also saw something else. I saw the man he had underestimated, the man who had built everything from nothing, the man who was supposed to be gone, yet was standing, breathing, waiting. The smoke had cleared, the truth was visible, and I was ready to walk into the fire again, not to burn, but to make sure the liar felt the heat of what he had created. After the smoke cleared and the truth revealed its edges, silence became my closest companion. I stopped reacting. I stopped questioning. I began watching. People mistake stillness for weakness, but stillness is where planning lives. In the days that followed, I moved like a shadow through the world that believed I was gone. I had already been buried once by lies. Now I would rise quietly through facts. The first step was understanding how deep his deception ran. The insurance company had confirmed the fraud, but I needed more, not just legal evidence, but proof that could cut through every excuse. I wanted the truth to be so complete that no one could twist it. So, I began my quiet investigation, not as a broken father, but as a man determined to restore his name. I started at the roots, my home, my papers, my bank. Each file became a memory and a clue. In old drawers, I found letters, receipts, documents that connected me to the world. Birth certificates, property deeds, medical reports. Every single one had my signature, my handwriting, my life. Those would become my proof of existence. My identity wasn't a piece of plastic or a stamp on paper. It was 50 years of living that could not be erased. But his forgery was clever. Every claim he made was supported by false witnesses and falsified dates. He had used technology I barely understood, scanned signatures, online forms, even emails created in my name. It was like fighting a ghost made of pixels and lies. But I didn't give up. I wrote everything down. I built my own timeline of truth, line by line, page by page. I kept a notebook, my ledger of life. In it, I listed every person who had seen me in those months, every place I had gone, every transaction I had made. I wrote the date, time, and purpose. It was slow work, but I was patient. Patience was my greatest weapon. It always had been. When you've worked a lifetime on broken machines, you learn that fixing things takes silence and focus, not noise. Every day began with tea and a notebook. The lawyer would call sometimes, updating me about new developments. Investigators had confirmed the bank transfers, the forged signatures, and the false statements. But I wanted more. I wanted to see the look on every face that had believed I was gone. I wanted them to see the man they buried walk right past them, breathing. So, I went out. Slowly. Quietly. I visited the old shop where I used to buy my groceries. The owner froze when he saw me, his face turning pale. "You're alive," he whispered, though I didn't need him to say it. That small shock, that small piece of recognition, was worth more than gold. Every person who saw me was another witness that the story was false. I began collecting them. Witnesses of my life. The nurse at the clinic who checked my blood pressure 2 months after my death, the neighbor who borrowed my lawnmower, the postman who delivered my mail weekly. Each one gave a written statement confirming I had been alive. The puzzle pieces started to form a picture again, not the image of a dead man, but of a living truth. During those weeks, I also gathered proof of the financial trail. My lawyer helped request transaction records, tracing every movement of the insurance funds. The numbers told their own story. Transfers, deposits, property purchases, all tied back to my son's account. The pattern was clear. He had claimed my death, collected the money, and spent it as if I had never existed. Sometimes I would sit in the lawyer's office and stare at those numbers on the screen. It wasn't the money that hurt me. It was what it represented. The conversion of love into currency. Every dollar was a memory traded for greed. I realized then that betrayal doesn't always scream. Sometimes it signs receipts. Still, I stayed calm. The investigation wasn't just about catching him. It was about cleansing my own spirit of disbelief. For months, I had lived in the shadow of someone else's story. Now, I was reclaiming my narrative one paper at a time. The more proof I gathered, the stronger I felt. The insurance company's fraud department began cooperating with the police. They collected statements, verified my fingerprints, and opened an internal inquiry. My lawyer advised me not to confront my son yet. "Let the system do the talking," he said. But I wasn't just waiting. I was preparing. I started to document my findings in order. Every forged form, every false claim, every photograph and witness letter. I made copies and kept them safe in different places, one with my lawyer, one in a sealed envelope at the notary office, and one hidden in my home. If anything happened to me again, my truth would survive without me. I wouldn't let my name disappear twice. At night, I thought about him. I pictured him sleeping peacefully in his house, built on lies. Maybe he thought he had gotten away with it. Maybe he felt proud. Or maybe he had convinced himself that it wasn't really a crime. That's what greed does. It blurs the line between cleverness and cruelty. He probably told himself he deserved it, that I didn't need the money, that I wouldn't have known. But I knew, and I was still here. The lawyer arranged meetings with the investigators. I attended every one. I answered every question clearly, never losing my composure. The officers were respectful, even apologetic. They said they had never seen a case like this, a living man proving his own life after being declared dead by his own child. I told them I wasn't here for pity. I was here for proof. In one meeting, they showed me photos from the claim file, the fake memorial, the forged documents, even fake emails confirming my passing. It was surreal. It felt like attending my own funeral after the fact. I stared at the pictures for a long time. Then I said, "These are the things people make for the dead, but I am still breathing." Each day, more layers of truth surfaced. The forged witness signatures were traced to acquaintances of my son. The so-called funeral director denied involvement once shown the real documents. Slowly, the web unraveled. His empire of deceit began to crumble under the weight of simple honesty. Through it all, I stayed unseen. I didn't contact him. I didn't warn him. I wanted him to live comfortably in his illusion until the day it cracked from the inside. Because the most powerful truth is the one that walks quietly into a lie and stands there without a word. Weeks passed, then months. The evidence file grew thicker. The authorities prepared the legal proceedings. My son's name now appeared beside words like fraud, misrepresentation, and forgery. I felt no joy reading them, only finality, the same finality he had tried to write into my story. But I wasn't done. I wanted one last act, not of revenge, but of revelation. I didn't want him to simply lose his money. I wanted him to see the man he had buried. I wanted to stand before him, not in anger, but in presence, the one thing he thought he had erased. I planned my next move carefully. I asked my lawyer for the date when the investigation file would reach his employer. He was working at a well-known firm, respected and professional. The irony was bitter. He was surrounded by legality while living on a lie. I decided that was where the truth would meet him. Before the day arrived, I took one last quiet walk through my neighborhood. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the road. Every house, every tree, every step reminded me of how far I had come. People nodded politely, unsure whether to greet a man they once mourned. I smiled at them all. I didn't need their understanding. I just needed their memory, because memory is the greatest witness of all. That night, I packed a small folder, the official documents, the verification letters, and the final evidence. I laid them neatly inside, closed the folder, and set it on the table. My heart was steady. My mind was clear. Tomorrow, I would no longer be a ghost. Tomorrow, I would walk into his world and bring my silence with me. Before sleeping, I sat by the window. The sky was quiet, the stars sharp against the dark. I thought of all the things I had built in my life, walls, meals, lessons, laughter. And I thought of the one thing I had built without realizing it: resilience. When people steal from you, they take things you can replace. But when they steal your name, they take something sacred. I wasn't angry anymore. I was resolved, because truth, when it rises, does not shout. It simply stands. And I was ready to stand. After all the evidence was gathered, after the papers were signed and the truth sealed in black ink, there came a strange kind of stillness. Not peace, not closure, but waiting. The kind of waiting that stretches time thin, like a clock ticking underwater. I had everything I needed to expose him, but exposure had its own rhythm. Justice, like dawn, could not be rushed. It had to arrive in its own hour. In those days, my mornings became rituals of endurance. I woke before sunrise, brewed my tea, and sat by the window watching the light crawl across the walls. It was the same house, the same view, but the world felt different now. I wasn't the same man who once believed that blood alone meant loyalty. I had learned something that most people never want to face, that betrayal from your own child doesn't just break your heart. It resets your entire understanding of love. The lawyer called regularly with updates. The insurance investigation was wrapping up. The police were reviewing the criminal aspect. Every call confirmed what I already knew. The truth was winning, slowly but firmly. Yet I didn't feel joy. I felt a deep, hollow kind of calm, like a sea after a storm, still moving, still restless, but quieter. During that time, I stayed invisible. I didn't visit familiar places too often. I didn't tell anyone where I lived. I didn't want word of my return to reach my son before I was ready. I wanted the truth to meet him like a cold wind, sudden, undeniable, and impossible to escape. So I let the silence grow. Every sound became meaningful. The ring of a phone, the knock of mail at the door, the ticking of the clock. Everything reminded me that I was still alive, still present, still waiting for the moment to reclaim what was mine. I would spend hours reading through the documents I had collected, tracing each forged line, each fake signature. Sometimes I would close my eyes and imagine the day he filled out those forms. How steady his hand must have been as he wrote my name like an obituary. That image stayed with me. It kept me patient. It made me stronger. My lawyer advised me that soon the investigation report would become public. That meant his employers would know. His friends. The world he had built around his false virtue would begin to crumble. I imagined it, not with delight, but with inevitability. The truth is like water. No matter how tightly you seal the lid, it finds a crack. And I knew that day was near. Still, waiting was not easy. There were nights I would wake up with my heart pounding, my mind replaying the lies I had seen on paper. Sometimes I'd dream I was attending my own funeral, people crying, my son giving speeches, my photo surrounded by flowers. Then I would wake up sweating, the silence of the room swallowing the echo of that false grief. It's strange how lies can follow you into your sleep. But every morning, I reminded myself, silence is not surrender. Silence is strategy. Every second I waited was a thread tightening around the truth. Every day that passed without my face appearing reminded the world of the false story he had told. And when I would appear, the shock would be complete. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted impact. I also thought deeply about the kind of man I had become. Waiting gave me clarity. I had spent decades teaching my son about hard work, kindness, and patience. Ironically, those same lessons were now helping me undo his wrongdoing. I had no weapon, no army, no youth left. But I had time, truth, and discipline, and that was enough. Sometimes I would take quiet walks near the river at dusk. The water shimmered with evening light, reflecting fragments of the city, buildings, birds, and shadows. I found peace there. No one recognized me. No one pitied me. For a few minutes, I could simply exist. A man who had died once on paper, but was still breathing in truth. The breeze was kind, the silence honest. I realized that revenge wasn't what I wanted. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted the world to say, he was here. He lived. He mattered. As the investigation grew, I began receiving letters addressed to the living claimant. It was a strange title, but it made me smile. Each document that confirmed my existence felt like a small resurrection. The world was slowly rewriting its mistake. Every form that once called me dead now bore my signature, fresh, undeniable, alive. The days blurred together in their stillness. Waiting became a strange kind of meditation. I read old journals, looked through photo albums, and sometimes laughed at memories that had nothing to do with pain. I remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle, his tiny hands gripping mine. I remembered saving money for his education, patching his torn shoes, fixing his broken toys. Those memories hurt now, but they also reminded me that love, even when betrayed, remains pure. It's the heart that gets poisoned, not the love itself. One afternoon, my lawyer called. His voice sounded different, steady but tense. "The report is complete," he said. "It's going to his employer tomorrow." I didn't say anything for a while. I just listened to my own breathing. Then I whispered, "Good." Not in victory, but in finality. That was the moment I had been waiting for. The storm I had carried inside me for months finally had a destination. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up writing one last letter, not to him, but to myself. A reminder of what patience had built. I wrote, "Truth doesn't knock. It walks in, and when it does, it doesn't need permission." I folded that note and tucked it into my coat pocket. I would carry it with me the next morning, as a symbol, as a reminder that I wasn't going to war. I was going home to reclaim what was rightfully mine. As dawn approached, I sat by the window again. The light returned like a gentle promise. I thought about what I was about to do, not as revenge, but as a resurrection. My steps would be calm, my words few. I wouldn't raise my hand or my voice. I would just stand in front of him, the man who had written my death, and let my presence undo his lies. Waiting had transformed me. It had washed away the noise, the rage, the confusion. What remained was something cleaner, a steady, unwavering truth. The waiting had not been wasted time, it had been preparation. Because sometimes, silence builds power in ways words never can. When I finally stood to leave, I felt lighter than I had in years. My coat was heavy with documents, but my heart was unburdened. Every step I took toward that confrontation was guided by something deeper than anger. It was guided by justice, slow, patient, and absolute. And as I locked the door behind me, I realized that the waiting was over. The truth was no longer in the papers or the reports. The truth was me, walking, breathing, alive, and I was going to bring it straight to his doorstep. The day finally came when silence could no longer hold what truth had grown inside it. I woke before dawn. The air felt heavier that morning, not with fear, but with meaning. Every breath I took felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen from me. I sat on the edge of my bed, the world still dark outside, and looked at the folder resting on my table. Inside it were my documents, my resurrection, my identity, my proof of life. The papers looked ordinary, but they carried the weight of everything I had endured. I rose slowly, my old bones stiff from years of labor, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in decades. The waiting was over. The man they had buried on paper was about to walk into daylight. I buttoned my shirt with steady hands, pressed my jacket, and combed back what little hair remained. I wanted to look like myself, not a ghost, not a victim, but the man who had built the very life his son had tried to erase. The city was waking as I stepped outside. The early light painted the streets in soft gold. Cars moved quietly, shopkeepers opened shutters, and the air smelled faintly of rain from the night before. I walked to the bus stop, carrying nothing but my folder and the calm that comes from certainty. People brushed past me, unaware that they were walking beside a man who had been declared dead. I almost smiled at the thought. The world was full of miracles, and today I was one of them. The ride to his office was long, but I didn't mind. I watched the world slide by through the window, the buildings, the parks, the families rushing to work. Somewhere, in one of those towers, was my son, sitting in a chair bought with my money, enjoying a reputation built on lies. But that was about to change. When I reached the building, I stood on the sidewalk for a while. It was tall, glass and steel, polished and proud. The kind of place that pretends to be honest just because it shines. People in suits hurried past me, tapping on phones, holding coffee cups, too busy to notice an old man standing still. I looked up at the name of the company etched in silver letters. I had seen it before on envelopes addressed to him. This was where he built his new life, the life he funded with the story of my death. I entered the lobby slowly. The air inside was cool, the floor gleamed. I could see my reflection in the marble tiles, a reminder that I was still real. I approached the reception desk, my steps soft but sure. The young woman behind the counter looked up and smiled politely. I told her my name and asked to see the manager. She typed something, paused, and looked at me again. I could see the confusion flicker across her face when she read the name. Maybe she recognized it from a company memo. Maybe she had heard about my death. The wait was short. A man in a gray suit appeared, professional and polite. He asked me to follow him to a small meeting room. I thanked him quietly and walked behind him. Each step echoed faintly in the hallway. My heart was steady. There was no anger left, no trembling. I was ready. The room was plain, white walls, glass windows, a table in the center. I placed my folder on it carefully, as if it were fragile glass. The manager sat across from me, unsure of what this meeting was about. I introduced myself again and handed him my identification, the official documents, and the report that proved my living status. He looked through them slowly, flipping page after page. With each one, his eyebrows lifted a little higher. He glanced at me, then back at the papers. When he reached the insurance file, the one with my forged death certificate, his hand stopped moving. I watched him read the signature, my son's, pretending to be mine. The silence in that room was thick. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner, the faint murmur of voices from the hallway, the beating of my own heart. Then he leaned back and exhaled, long and low. The truth had landed. He looked at me with disbelief, as if trying to reconcile the breathing man in front of him with the name on the death certificate. "Are you saying?" he began, but I raised a hand slightly. I didn't need him to finish. I simply nodded and pointed to the evidence. Everything he needed to know was written there, stamped, verified, legal. I didn't have to speak. The papers spoke for me. He picked up the phone and made a quiet call. His tone was calm but urgent. Within minutes, another person entered the room, someone from Human Resources, maybe a senior officer. They began reviewing the documents together, whispering, glancing between the pages and my face. I sat still, hands folded, eyes steady. I wasn't nervous. I had lived through worse storms. I had been erased once. Nothing frightened me anymore. They asked if I would wait a few minutes. I nodded. The manager left the room with the folder in hand. I knew where he was going. He was going to get my son. The wait stretched longer than it should have, but I didn't mind. I could feel the world shifting, like gears aligning after years of being jammed. The truth was moving again. I could hear footsteps outside, quick and uneven. A voice, familiar even through walls, was rising. My son's. Then, the door opened. He walked in, looking confident, curious, maybe a little annoyed. But when his eyes met mine, the color drained from his face. He froze in the doorway. For a moment, time stood still. The man who had signed my death certificate was staring at the man he declared dead. We didn't need words. His shock was enough. His body trembled slightly, his lips parted, but no sound came out. Behind him, the manager and the HR officer stood silently, holding the folder. They didn't know what to say. They didn't need to. I sat there, unmoving. The sunlight from the window fell across the table, lighting up the documents, my identification, the fraud reports, the insurance statements. It was as if the light itself had chosen sides. He took a step forward, then another, then stopped. The room felt smaller now. The air thickened with everything left unsaid: guilt, disbelief, recognition. His eyes darted to the papers, then back to me. Maybe he hoped it was a dream, a mistake, a haunting. But I was real, and the truth was right there between us, printed in black ink. The manager broke the silence first. He asked my son if he wanted to explain. The words hung in the air like a sentence waiting to be read aloud. My son's mouth opened, then closed again. He tried to speak, but every excuse crumbled before it could take shape. He looked lost, cornered, small, not by my anger, but by his own choices. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I simply sat, breathing, letting the reality sink into the room. The dead man was alive, and his presence was louder than any accusation. The HR officer began documenting everything. They made copies of the evidence, signed acknowledgement forms, and confirmed the validity with the insurance contact. I watched it all happen with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had built this entire moment from patience. There was no need for revenge now. The truth had become its own weapon. At one point, my son tried to reach for the folder. The manager stopped him. "Not yours," he said sharply. That single sentence hit harder than any punishment. It stripped away the illusion he had built. The power, the authority, the control. For the first time, he stood there, not as a man of success, but as a man exposed. The meeting ended with a few signatures and a statement of acknowledgement. My lawyer arrived soon after to finalize the formalities. Police officers were notified. The company would cooperate with the investigation. My son was asked to step outside while they finished the paperwork. He hesitated, then obeyed, his eyes never meeting mine again. As he walked out, I exhaled for the first time in hours. The weight I had carried for months began to lift. The truth was no longer a secret. It was official, recorded, witnessed. My death had been undone, not by miracle, but by persistence. When everything was done, the manager stood and shook my hand. His grip was firm, respectful. "I'm sorry this happened to you," he said softly. I nodded. "Don't be," I replied. "It happened for a reason." I left the building slowly, stepping back into the sunlight. The air felt different, cleaner, lighter. People hurried past me again, unaware of what had just taken place inside, but I knew. I had just come back from the dead in front of the man who buried me. As I walked away, I didn't feel anger. I felt completion. I didn't turn around to see if he was watching. I didn't need to. The truth had already burned itself into his world, and it would follow him wherever he went. That was the day of my return, not to punish, not to shout, but to stand. to remind the living that lies cannot bury the truth forever. And as I reached the corner, the sun broke through the clouds, warm and bright on my face. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive, truly, quietly, beautifully alive. When the meeting room door closed behind my son, the air in that office seemed to change weight. The world outside continued in its rhythm, phones ringing, keyboards clattering, footsteps crossing marble floors. But inside that glass box, time had thickened. What began as paperwork was now a courtroom made of sunlight and silence. Everything that had been hidden behind forged signatures and polite lies was about to stand in plain view. The manager asked us to step into a larger conference hall. It was brighter there, with long windows that let the city pour in. A few senior officers joined. The HR head, 2 company directors, and the legal advisor. They didn't know yet what story they were about to witness. They just sensed that something irreversible had arrived. I took a seat near the far end of the table, my folder resting in front of me. My son sat opposite, eyes down, fingers tapping nervously against the wood. Every sound he made echoed. The manager began by summarizing the evidence. His voice was calm but precise, the tone of someone trying to control the tremor of disbelief. He laid out the sequence: the false death certificate, the forged claims, the insurance payout, and the banking trail. Each detail was like a nail being driven into a coffin built by lies. He didn't embellish anything. He didn't need to. The document spoke clearly. The only sound in the room was the flipping of pages and the low hum of the air conditioning. Then he said the words that made everyone stop breathing for a second. "The claimant, declared deceased, is sitting with us right now." A hush fell so heavy it seemed to swallow every other noise. Every head turned toward me. Some eyes widened. Others darted between me and the papers, as if trying to reconcile the impossible. I didn't move. I let the truth sink in slowly, like dawn filtering into a dark room. The HR director covered her mouth. One of the men whispered something like a prayer. Across the table, my son's face turned pale, as if the life he had stolen was suddenly draining back to its owner. The manager continued reading, but his voice carried a different weight now, respect mixed with quiet anger. He explained how the internal audit had confirmed the fraud and how the insurance company's legal division had already been informed. He said police investigators were en route to collect formal statements. The words were simple, bureaucratic, almost dull, but to me, they were thunder. Every syllable was a piece of justice being put into place. My son finally spoke. His voice cracked, small and strained. He muttered something about a misunderstanding, about paperwork confusion. No one responded. The manager just opened another folder and showed him the timestamps, the transfer logs, the electronic signature trace that led straight to his personal account. Each proof closed another door behind him. There was nowhere left to run. I watched him without hatred. There was a strange mercy in me, not forgiveness, but understanding of how small he had become inside his greed. He had once been the boy who held my hand crossing roads. Now he was a man trying to outrun his own reflection. And here we were, sitting under bright lights, the past and present colliding in front of witnesses. The HR director began asking formal questions, documenting every response. Each time he tried to explain, his voice faltered. Each time he denied, another document contradicted him. The manager's patience thinned, the lawyers scribbled notes, and the silence between sentences felt like judgment itself. At one point, my son looked straight at me, desperate for a lifeline, for me to rescue him, as I always had. But I stayed still. This was no longer between father and son. This was between truth and deceit. When the police arrived, the atmosphere shifted again, not chaotic, but solemn. 2 officers entered quietly, respectful, not intrusive. They greeted the manager, took their seats, and began reviewing the evidence already assembled. I provided my identification once more, my living verification documents, and the sworn affidavit from the insurance investigators. The officers compared signatures, checked stamps, noted dates. Their professionalism felt like grace, precise, clean, emotionless. It was the kind of order that restores balance after too much disorder. As they read through the file, the older officer looked at me with a small nod. It wasn't sympathy, it was acknowledgement. He had probably seen countless fraud cases, but few where the victim had to prove he was alive. That nod told me he understood, not just the law, but the heartbreak beneath it. They turned to my son and asked routine questions. His answers grew shorter, his eyes redder. Each word he spoke carried less conviction. Eventually, the officer read him the formal warning about giving false statements. That was the moment his shoulders dropped. He realized there was no clever sentence that could undo what he'd done. The truth had solidified around him like wet cement hardening. Someone from the company recorded the proceedings. There were signatures to collect, witness notes to attach. The sound of pens scratching paper filled the room, the sound of closure being written. Through it all, I sat quiet, watching the small details. The light glinting off the polished table, the slow movement of the clock hands, the faint reflection of my own face in the glass wall. For the first time in months, that reflection looked whole again. After the officers finished, they thanked the company for cooperation and said formal charges would be processed within the week. They asked if I wished to file a personal statement. I said yes. My voice was steady. I spoke briefly, clearly, not about anger or revenge, but about the sanctity of truth. I told them that no man should ever be buried by a lie. That paperwork can erase names, but not existence. They wrote it all down. Every word became part of the record. Then they turned to my son. He was shaking now, hands clasped together. He whispered apologies under his breath, but the words fell uselessly into the space between us. Apologies after profit are just noise. He had chosen wealth over conscience, and conscience always collects its due. When the police left, the manager excused himself briefly, leaving just the two of us in the room. For a moment, the silence was unbearable. He looked at me, his eyes wet, his face drawn with disbelief and shame. I didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. He had already written our final conversation when he signed that death claim. Words now would only soil the clarity of truth. So I let the silence speak. And in that silence, everything he had destroyed echoed back to him: trust, respect, family. All gone, all earned. The HR director returned, handed me a copy of the internal report, and said the company would cooperate fully with authorities. She thanked me for my dignity, said the staff had never seen someone handle betrayal with such calm. I didn't feel proud hearing that. Calm isn't strength, it's what's left when you've already lost everything worth shouting for. I stood, collected my papers, and nodded politely to everyone in the room. They all stood too, instinctively, as if something sacred was leaving. My son didn't rise. He just sat there, staring at the floor, tears gathering where excuses had once lived. I walked past him slowly, my footsteps echoing. When I reached the door, I paused for a second, not to look back, but to take one last breath of that space. It smelled of coffee, ink, and consequence. Then I opened the door and stepped out. Outside, employees were gathered in small clusters, whispering. News travels fast in offices. Some recognized me from photographs that had circulated months earlier, the obituary, the memorial posts. They stared as if they'd seen a ghost. In a way, they had. I walked through the corridor silently, each step erasing a lie. By the time I reached the elevator, the whispers had turned to stunned silence. The doors closed behind me with a soft chime, a full stop at the end of a very long sentence. Down in the lobby, sunlight poured through the glass like forgiveness. I stepped outside and let it wash over me. People passed, unaware that history had just been corrected upstairs. I looked at the sky, clear, wide, endless, and thought of all the nights I'd stared at it wondering if truth still mattered in this world. Now I knew it did. It always does. It just takes time to show its face. I didn't go straight home. I walked through the city for hours, letting the day settle into me. Every noise sounded sharper: the rustle of leaves, the hum of traffic, the laughter of strangers. I felt alive in every sense of the word. Alive because I had proven it. Alive because I had refused to disappear. By evening, the lawyer called to confirm the formal charges had been filed. He said my testimony had been flawless, the evidence airtight. I thanked him, hung up, and sat by a fountain in the city square. Children were playing nearby, their laughter rising above the sound of water. I watched them for a long time. It reminded me of simpler days, days when love hadn't yet turned into a transaction. That night, I returned to my quiet apartment. I placed the documents on the table and poured myself a cup of tea. The steam rose like a prayer. I thought of my son, not with rage, but with sorrow. Some wounds don't need anger to hurt. They hurt because they once held love, but pain loses its sharpness when the truth finally breathes. I looked out the window at the city lights and whispered to myself, "It's done." Not in triumph, but in peace. The confrontation had ended without a single shout, yet it echoed louder than any war. The man who had buried me in paperwork was now buried under proof. And I, the man they thought gone, had walked quietly back into the world. That was my justice, simple, legal, undeniable. And in the silence of that night, I realized something even deeper. Truth does not always roar. Sometimes it simply stands in a room full of lies and refuses to sit down. The news spread faster than wind, faster than gossip, faster than shame could hide itself. By the end of that week, the story had crossed the walls of that office, traveled through corridors, reached homes, screens, and conversations. People whispered about the man who came back from the dead. They spoke of the fraud, the insurance, the public reveal. Some told it like a scandal. Others told it like a miracle. No one forgot the look on my son's face. The man who had buried his own father in paperwork and found him walking through the front door of his job. The company released a statement to the insurance firm, confirming the truth. The emails were cold, factual, clinical. They listed times, documents, signatures, timestamps. There was no emotion in them, just precision. But behind every sentence lived a quiet storm. His colleagues read them with disbelief. The man they'd admired for his confidence now looked small, stripped of the power that came from deception. Whispers filled the cafeteria. Glances followed him in the hallways, and silence greeted him in meetings. Nobody had to say it out loud. Everyone knew. He tried to keep going, tried to show up with the same polished shoes and practiced smile. But confidence dies when truth walks in the room. It doesn't vanish suddenly. It fades, piece by piece, like old paint peeling from a wall. He started shrinking under the weight of stares. People stopped laughing at his jokes, stopped asking his opinion. The phone that once rang endlessly began to stay quiet. Invitations that once came freely were suddenly lost in the mail. He had built a life on false respect, and when respect was gone, nothing remained but the hollow echo of what he'd stolen. Outside the office, the story grew teeth. The insurance company filed a formal fraud case. Investigators called me for follow-up details, and I gave them everything they needed. Every paper, every signed lie, every proof that I had lived while being declared dead. They thanked me, and I thanked them, because they treated me like a man again, not a rumor. They saw truth as something that still mattered. I watched as justice began moving, slow but steady, like an old train starting on cold tracks. Relatives called too, not all at once, but in hesitant waves. Some sounded guilty, realizing they had believed the lie too easily. Some avoided the subject, speaking only of the weather or my health. Others tried to defend him, saying, "He must have been desperate." I listened to all of them, but my answers were the same, calm, brief, polite. Desperation may explain, but it doesn't excuse. When someone decides to kill you on paper to fatten their wallet, they don't act out of desperation, they act out of greed. The neighbors reacted differently. They stopped meeting his eyes. The same street that once knew him as a charming young man now looked at him as a cautionary tale. People would cross paths and fall silent when he passed. They'd talk later, behind curtains and fences. I didn't need to hear the words to know their tone. Pity mixed with disgust. He had stolen not only from his father, but from everyone's trust in what family meant. The bank froze his accounts first. Then the legal notices arrived. Each letter he opened took away another piece of his imagined security. The money he had stolen turned to dust the moment the law recognized my name again. Everything he had built on fraud began to collapse. His car was repossessed, his home mortgaged to cover legal costs. Even his friends began disappearing, one by one. People who had once toasted to his success now found excuses to stay away. Nobody wants to share a table with a man who faked his father's death for money. But I didn't celebrate. There was no joy in watching it happen. Revenge loses meaning when you understand the cost of it all. What happened wasn't revenge. It was balance. The universe has a quiet way of returning what you send out, just colder and slower. I didn't smile when I heard he'd lost his job. I didn't gloat when I learned he'd been questioned by police again. I simply sat by my window, looking out at the world, and thought about how far love can fall when greed starts climbing. The weeks that followed were filled with silence. He tried to reach me through letters, through intermediaries, even through mutual relatives. The words he sent were full of apology, full of sorrow, full of excuses. But sometimes apologies are not bridges, they're anchors. They come too late, after the ship has already drifted too far. I read his letters, folded them quietly, and placed them in a drawer. Not to remember, but to remind myself that some lessons must remain written, not relived. Then came the court hearings. I attended everyone, not to watch him suffer, but to witness justice complete its circle. Each time, I sat in the back row, quiet and invisible, letting the process unfold. His lawyers tried to argue confusion, emotional distress, misunderstanding. But documents don't have feelings. They just tell the truth, line by line. The insurance company's representative spoke firmly, showing how every false form bore his name and how every withdrawal traced back to his account. When the verdict came, conviction and restitution, I didn't feel victory. I felt air. Clean, cold, honest air. The judgment required that he repay the stolen funds and face a suspended sentence for fraud, pending restitution. It was mercy, in a way. He would not rot in a cell. He would live long enough to understand what he'd done. The weight of that kind of understanding is heavier than bars. When I left the courthouse, reporters tried to ask questions, but I said nothing. I just kept walking. Truth doesn't need interviews. It stands quietly, and people see it for what it is. Over time, the noise faded. The scandal became yesterday's news, then last month's memory, then a quiet story people still whispered about when they wanted to remind each other that greed always backfires. I moved away from the city, back to the countryside where mornings began with birds instead of headlines. The distance was like medicine. The farther I went, the lighter I felt. I built a small garden, planted trees, tended to the soil, things that asked nothing from me but patience. In every seed I buried, I found something pure again. Meanwhile, my son stayed where he was, rebuilding his life from ruins. I didn't check on him, but word traveled through others. He lived smaller now, not poor, but humbled. He walked slower, spoke less. Maybe that was punishment enough. Maybe humility had finally found him where love once lived. I hoped so, not out of vengeance, but out of the faint wish that no man should die ignorant of his own wrongs. Months passed, seasons changed. One evening, as I watched the sun go down, I thought about how everything had come full circle. Once, he had declared me dead to steal what was mine. Then, I had walked into his world and declared the truth alive. In the end, both of us lost something. He lost his name, and I lost a son. Some things you can't recover with money or time. Some wounds don't heal. They simply stop bleeding. There were days I missed him, not the man he became, but the boy he was. The boy who laughed freely, who ran to me with scraped knees, who believed his father could fix anything. That boy had vanished long before the lie was written. Maybe that's what grief truly is. Not just losing someone to death, but watching them vanish while still breathing. I made peace with that, slowly, the way mountains make peace with rain, by letting it fall over and over until it stops hurting. Years later, People still ask why I didn't forgive him. They say forgiveness brings peace. Maybe it does, for some. But I found peace not in forgiving the wrong, but in refusing to repeat it. Forgiveness, for me, was not pretending it didn't happen. It was accepting that it did and choosing not to carry it forward. The story ended where it began, with truth. That's all I ever wanted back. In the village where I now live, there's a small cafe where I sit every morning. The owner greets me with a smile, always asking if I want my usual tea. Nobody there knows my past. Nobody there calls me the man who returned from the dead. I am simply an old man with a kind smile and quiet eyes. That anonymity feels like grace. It means my story has stopped being a headline and become what it truly was, a life lesson. Sometimes I write short notes in my journal, not for publication, not for memory, but for peace. On one page I wrote, "The sun took my money. The lie took my name, but I took back my life." That single line carries everything: the betrayal, the justice, the stillness after the storm. Now, when I think of my son, I don't see the courtroom or the office. I see him as a small boy again, asleep on my shoulder after a long day. That's how I choose to remember him. Because revenge fades, but memories, the real ones, remain. And that is the truest part of the fallout. Not the money lost or the name cleared, but the realization that even betrayal cannot destroy the peace of a man who stands on truth. When everything was said and done, the papers signed, the accounts frozen, the court sessions closed, I didn't feel victory. I felt weight, heavy, quiet, lingering weight. The kind that doesn't hurt loudly, but presses softly over time, reminding you that justice is never joy. It's simply balance restored. And sometimes balance means walking away from what you once called home. I packed one small suitcase, just a few clothes, my documents, and an old photograph of my wife smiling in the garden behind our house. That picture had followed me through years of life, through laughter, sickness, storms, and now this strange, hollow peace. I left behind furniture, memories, and the echoes of my son's voice. They no longer belonged to me. They belonged to a story that had ended. The train station was almost empty that morning. A soft fog drifted across the tracks, blurring the world beyond the platform. I sat on a bench, suitcase by my feet, and watched the rails stretch into the distance. For the first time in years, I didn't have anywhere I had to be. No job, no meetings, no responsibilities, just space. A strange, silent kind of freedom that felt like both loss and liberation. When the train arrived, I boarded slowly, feeling my knees complain with age. The compartment was nearly empty. A young couple whispering, a mother with a child asleep on her shoulder, a man with a briefcase pretending not to cry. I sat by the window and watched the city slide away, each passing building shrinking like a memory fading into fog. I thought of the years I'd spent in that city, working, sacrificing, believing that family would be the anchor of my old age. I had built my life around that belief, and now I was learning to live without it. Hours passed. The landscape changed. Concrete gave way to fields, fields gave way to forests, and the noise of the city was replaced by wind. It wasn't silence, it was peace, wearing a softer sound. I realized how long it had been since I'd heard something as simple as trees moving. The farther I went, the more the ache inside me began to loosen. By evening, I arrived in a small coastal town I had visited once long ago with my wife. Back then, we had promised to retire there, to live out our final years by the sea. Life had changed. Time had taken her before that dream came true, but somehow I found myself keeping that promise. Alone, but faithful. I rented a modest room above a bakery, the air thick with the smell of bread each morning. The landlady was kind, her eyes full of warmth, the kind of warmth that doesn't ask questions. She didn't know my name beyond Mr. Samuel, and I didn't offer more. Days began to form patterns. Mornings started with tea by the window, afternoons with walks by the shore. The ocean was my company now, vast, endless, and indifferent to my story. I liked that. It didn't care who I was or what I had lost. It simply existed, steady and patient, a mirror of what I hoped to become. I started writing again, not for others, but for myself. Pages filled slowly with reflections, not regrets. I wrote about patience, about betrayal, about the quiet dignity of walking away. I wrote not to remember the pain, but to remember that I survived it. My words were not weapons. They were reminders that peace was possible, even after everything. Sometimes people in town would ask why I came there. I'd smile and say, for the weather. It was easier than explaining that I had left behind a lifetime of disappointment. I helped out at the local library on slow afternoons, organizing old books, dusting forgotten shelves. The librarian, an elderly woman with soft eyes and endless kindness, told me once, "You have the look of someone who has seen everything." I smiled and replied, "Only enough to know what to let go of." On weekends, I walked to the small chapel on the hill, not for prayer, but for quiet. I'd sit in the back pew and watch sunlight fall through colored glass, painting the floor in patterns that shifted with time. That light reminded me that everything broken can still be beautiful if seen through the right lens. Sometimes at night, I would stand on the shore and think of my son, not with anger, not with longing, but with acceptance. I knew he was facing his own silence now. I didn't wish him pain, only clarity. I hoped that somewhere, amid the noise of his regret, he found the stillness to understand the value of truth. Maybe someday, long after I was gone, he would tell someone my story, not as revenge, but as a lesson. That would be enough. I didn't tell anyone in the town that I had once been declared dead. To them, I was just another quiet old man with steady hands and kind eyes. And in that anonymity, I found something I hadn't felt in years: peace without pretense. I realized that sometimes the greatest revenge is to live freely, unbothered, untouched by the noise of those who hurt you. Months turned into a year. I grew older, slower, softer. The bakery lady often brought me warm rolls in the evening, and the children from the neighborhood called me Grandpa Sam. I never corrected them. Maybe that's what I was always meant to be, a grandpa, not just to one, but to anyone who needed kindness. I learned to enjoy the smallest things again: the warmth of sunlight on my back, the sound of rain tapping against glass, the smell of old books, the laughter of strangers. These became my riches. I no longer needed bank accounts or property deeds to feel secure. I had built my peace with things no one could steal. Every December, when the air turned cold, I would take a walk by the sea and whisper my wife's name into the wind. It made me feel less alone, as if the waves carried her laughter back to me. One such evening, I wrote in my journal, "Home isn't where your family lives. It's where you can breathe without fear." And I breathed freely there. Sometimes when I passed the mirror, I barely recognized myself, not because of age, but because of peace. My reflection no longer carried the tension of betrayal or the heaviness of anger. It looked like someone who had finally learned that life doesn't need to be fair. It only needs to be lived honestly. Years went by quietly. I became part of the town's rhythm. The old man who always tipped well, who fed stray cats, who told gentle stories to children about sunsets and rivers instead of money and inheritance. Nobody knew I once stood in a courtroom proving I was alive. And maybe that was the truest victory of all. Not the justice, not the exposure, but the ability to become ordinary again after extraordinary pain. I started donating small sums anonymously to local charities, schools, clinics, old-age homes. Not to prove anything, but to turn what was once stolen from me into something that could never be stolen again: kindness. Each act felt like another piece of peace returned to the world. By the time I turned 80, the past had become nothing more than quiet ripples in still water. Sometimes I thought of visiting my son again, but then I remembered that some doors, once closed, should stay closed. The lesson had been taught. The truth had been seen. There was no need to reopen wounds that had already healed into scars. Now, when I sit by the sea at dusk, I think of one thing only: gratitude. Gratitude that I lived long enough to see that truth, once lost, can be reclaimed. Gratitude that my story didn't end in anger, but in silence and light. Because sometimes the most powerful act of revenge isn't to destroy what hurt you. It's to rebuild yourself so completely that your peace becomes louder than their cruelty ever was. Now, as an old man, I sit by my window each morning and watch the sea roll in, the light dancing across the waves like forgiveness I never had to ask for. The world feels slower now, softer. My hands are weaker, but they no longer tremble with anger or grief. They simply rest, like old tools finally put away after a lifetime of work. The salt in the air stings my lungs sometimes, but it reminds me that I am alive. Alive. A word that once had to be proven on paper. There are moments when I think about everything that happened. The lie, the theft, the courtroom, the silence that followed. It doesn't feel like rage anymore. It feels like distance. Time, I've learned, doesn't erase pain. It dilutes it. What once burned like fire now drifts like smoke, visible only when the light catches it. That's what survival is, I suppose, not escaping the flames, but learning how to breathe again once the smoke clears. Sometimes people in this town ask why I live alone. They see my calm and mistake it for loneliness. But solitude isn't the same as being alone. Loneliness is waiting for someone to return. Solitude is realizing you don't need them to. I have learned to make peace with silence, to fill it with small, quiet joys, a warm meal, a letter from an old friend, the laughter of children outside. These are enough, more than enough. The older I grow, the clearer everything becomes. Betrayal isn't just about money or lies. It's about how easily people forget the hands that built them. I spent years working, saving, loving, and trusting. I thought that would be enough to protect me from cruelty. But family doesn't always mean loyalty. Blood may connect you, but it doesn't bind your conscience. I learned that the hard way, but I learned it well. When my son declared me dead to steal from me, he didn't just take money. He took the idea of love I had built around him. For a while, I thought that would destroy me. But life has a strange way of balancing its own scales. Truth, once hidden, always finds its way to the surface. It may take months, or years, or decades, but it comes. Always. The day I walked into that office and saw him standing there, alive in his lie, confident in his theft, I didn't feel hatred. I felt clarity. I realized in that exact moment that sometimes justice doesn't wear the face of punishment. Sometimes it looks like a man walking quietly into the room you swore was empty. Sometimes it sounds like silence louder than applause. That day, I didn't win. I simply became whole again. I've often wondered if he ever understood what I was trying to teach him all those years. Not through lectures, but through how I lived. That honesty builds slowly, but dishonesty collapses instantly. That trust, once broken, cannot be glued back together with tears. Maybe he learned it too late. Maybe he's still learning. Maybe that's his punishment. Waking up every day knowing that the man he buried still walks the earth, not out of spite, but out of principle. In this quiet life, I've come to understand the true meaning of strength. Strength isn't shouting, or fighting, or proving someone wrong. It's the calm to walk away when the world demands you to react. It's the patience to let truth speak when lies have screamed for too long. And it's the dignity to live peacefully while others drown in their own noise. When I look back now, I don't see tragedy. I see transformation. The betrayal that once broke me became the doorway to peace. I had to lose everything I thought I needed to discover what I truly did. Self-respect. There's a kind of peace that only comes after the storm has taken everything. Because when the storm is gone, you finally see what couldn't be washed away. I don't know what became of my son after the trial. People told me he left the city, that he works quietly now, keeps to himself. Maybe guilt has softened him. Maybe pride still blinds him. I don't wish him harm. I never did. I only wished he'd learn what I learned. That the worth of a man isn't in his possessions, but in his principles. You can rebuild a house, but not a reputation. You can earn money again, but not the trust you've spent. Every evening, when the sun begins to set, I make myself a cup of tea and sit outside. The ocean turns gold for a few minutes, then darkens into blue. In that color change, I see my life, the brightness of youth fading into the calm of age, and I feel grateful, because not everyone gets a second chance to tell their own story. I was given mine. I was written off as dead, but I lived long enough to remind the world, and myself, that truth breathes even after it's buried. There's something deeply freeing about knowing that you have nothing left to prove. I don't owe anyone explanations or apologies. I don't need validation from those who once doubted me. I exist as I am, quiet, steady, free. That freedom didn't come from money or justice. It came from choosing peace over pride. If there's one thing I've learned in this long life, it's that betrayal can't touch a man who refuses to become bitter. Bitterness is the thief's second victory. When you hold on to hate, you let the wrong keep winning. But when you let it go, not forget, not forgive blindly, but simply release, you take your power back. You stand taller, even if you stand alone. Sometimes I wonder if my wife can see me from wherever she is. If she knows I kept my promise, to protect what we built, to live with dignity, to never let greed define our name. I like to think she would be proud, not because I exposed our son, but because I didn't let darkness change who I was. I remained the man she loved, quiet, patient, steadfast. There's an old saying I once heard, "The loudest revenge is peace." I didn't understand it then. I do now, because peace doesn't need to announce itself. It just settles over you like dawn, slow, sure, unstoppable. The kind of peace that can't be stolen, forged, or faked. The kind that lives deep inside, where no betrayal can reach. Now, as I close this chapter, I realize that my story isn't about a stolen insurance check or a fraudulent claim. It's about truth. How fragile it seems, yet how unbreakable it truly is. Lies may run ahead, but truth always walks, and walking takes you farther in the end. When I speak to you now, whoever you are, listening from your home, your phone, or some faraway place, remember this: dignity is your final inheritance. Don't trade it for comfort. Don't silence it for approval. Protect it the way you'd protect your own life, because one day it might be all you have left. And if someone betrays you, if they lie, steal, abandon, or break your trust, don't rush to destroy them. Just step back, gather your truth, and let time do what time always does. Reveal everything. The world doesn't forget, and peace, when it returns, is heavier than any revenge. I have lived long enough to see both cruelty and justice, love and greed, beginnings and ends. I've learned that life doesn't always give closure in loud moments. Sometimes it gives it in silence, in the sound of waves, in the warmth of morning light, in the quiet knowledge that you survived with your soul intact. So here I sit, an old man, alive in every sense of the word. My son once wrote me dead for money, but I wrote myself back to life with truth. And that truth, simple and steady, is the legacy I leave behind. Because in the end, life doesn't ask who hurt you. It asks who you became because of it.